Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about session 24. So let's go ahead and get started. I am Ra. I greet you in the love and in the light of the infinite creator. I communicate now. Questioner. We are a little concerned about the physical condition of the instrument. She has a slight congestion. If you can tell me of the suitability of this session at all, I would appreciate it. I am Ra. The instrument's vital energies of the physical complex are low. The session will be appropriately shortened. So here, right off the bat, Dawn is asking about Carla. She is sick. We will find out within the next couple of sessions that this is a consequence of her LSD use. And we find out, I think quite a bit later, that when Carla goes into trance for a session, the energy that she will use for that session is already spent. So if she's in trance and Dawn's talking to Ra, it's best for Dawn to just continue talking to Ra, even though I think he's anticipating Ra maybe saying, no, we shouldn't do this today, goodbye. Ra would never do that because the energy has already been given to Ra for the communication. So they're going to use it because Carla gave it to them and there's no giving it back to her. But she isn't well, her physical complex energies are low, so it is going to be a slightly shorter session this time. So 24.2, Dawn asks, she requests that if it is possible for you to cause the instrument's vehicle to cough at intervals, that would help her. Is this possible? I am Ra. Please restate query specifying interval. Questioner. She requests that you cause the instrument to cough about at least after each communication. Is this possible? I am Ra. This is possible. Cough. So, Ra's trying to honor that request to keep her airways clear of phlegm, presumably. Whether or not that was necessary or not, Ra does try to do that here. So, in 24.4, Dawn says, thank you. The way I intend to continue with the book is to follow on through the last 25,000-year cycle that we're in now, and possibly investigate a little of fourth density conditions, and thereby find many places that we can go back and delve further into the Law of One. The first material I expect to be not too deep with respect to the Law of One. I hope to get into greater philosophical areas of the Law of One in more advanced sessions so as to make the material progress so that it will be understandable. I hope that I'm following the right direction in this. In the last session you mentioned that during this last 25,000-year cycle, the Atlanteans, Egyptians, and those in South America were contacted, and then the Confederation departed. I understand the Confederation did not come back for some time. Could you tell me of the reasons and consequences and attitudes with respect to the next contact with those here on planet Earth? I am Ra. In the case of the Atlanteans, enlargements upon the information given resulted in those activities distorted towards bellicosity, which resulted in the final second Atlantean catastrophe, 10821, 10,821 of your years in the past, as you measure time. Many were displaced due to societal actions both upon Atlantis and upon those areas of what you would call North African deserts, to which some Atlanteans had gone after the first conflict. Earth changes continued due to these, what you would call, nuclear bombs and other crystal weapons, sinking the last great land masses approximately 9600 of your years ago. In the Egyptian and the South American experiments results, though not as widely devastating, were as far from the original intention of the Confederation. It was clear to not only us, but also to the Council and the Guardians, that our methods were not appropriate for this particular sphere. Our attitude thus was one of caution, observation, and continuing attempts to creatively discover methods whereby contact from our entities could be of service with the least distortion and, above all, with the least possibility of becoming perversions or antitheses of our intentions in sharing information. So here Ra is summarizing their failures, essentially. In Atlantis, 10,821 years ago, a very specific number makes me think that they dialed in the date when the Atlantean catastrophe, as they call it, the final second Atlantean catastrophe happened when the landmass sunk below the Earth due to nuclear weapon usage, is what they say. They saw that happening as a consequence of them receiving more and more information from the Confederation. So the more information that the Atlanteans received, the more bellicose they became, the closer and closer they came to that final catastrophe. So that's why the Confederation abandoned those people, quote unquote abandoned, stopped meddling with those people, I think is a lot more of a accurate way to phrase that. And then in Egypt and South America, while they didn't do anything as horrible as altering the physical layout of our planet with weaponry, it still was not a success in the eyes of the Confederation. What happened was far from their original intention. So the Council and the Guardians decided that these methods of interacting with the beings on our sphere were not appropriate. And so since then, they've been looking at ways to creatively discover new methods to contact us and influence us and hopefully guide us towards a spiritual awareness of infinity that would lead us to unity and not destruction of our sphere or destruction of each other. And they definitely don't want to do anything that could possibly be misinterpreted and turned into perversions of their ideals of unity. Again, Earth is just a special needs planet. We are not typical of how third densities bloom and flower into fourth density. We've created a lot of surprise catalyst for the Confederation. As Ra says at one point, there are no mistakes, but there are surprises. So I think we've surprised the Confederation enough with how eagerly we have distorted their attempts at helping us. So they're trying to find other ways in the background, and they are avoiding the ways that they know have failed in the past multiple times, which is landing on Earth, walking among us, disseminating information that way. It has become too distorted. Also giving us the technology to create weapons that can destroy our planet or each other. Those are the things that they are trying not to do anymore. Though I do think it's interesting that they apparently gave the nuclear weapon technology to the Atlanteans. They used it for destruction, and then they gave it to us again. And then we were using it for destruction again. So they obviously had some hope that we were different in our modern era and wouldn't do that again, but we did. We still used that technology to create weapons and not to help each other. So they've still tried some of those things again in the recent times, but it's still come about as not an ideal outcome from those interventions. So honestly, I get why they would consider washing their hands of us, but they aren't. They're always going to be here trying to help us. They're just not going to do it in such obvious ways that create so much drama and potential for casualties. So 24.5, Dawn says, "Could you have the instrument cough, please?" And Ra coughs. And then 24.6, Dawn says, "Thank you. Then I assume the Confederation stayed away from Earth for a period of time. What condition created the next contact the Confederation made?" I am Ra. In approximately 3600 of your years in the past, as you measure time, there was an influx of those of the Orion group, as you call them. Due to the increasing negative influences upon thinking and acting distortions, they were able to begin working with those whose impression from olden times, as you may say, was that they were special and different. An entity of the Confederation, many, many thousands of your years in the past, the one you may call Yahweh, had, by genetic cloning, set up these particular biases among these peoples who had come gradually to dwell in the vicinity of Egypt, as well as in many, many other places, by dispersion after the downsinking of the land mass Mu. Here the Orion group found fertile soil in which to plant the seeds of negativity, These seeds, as always, being those of the elite, the different, those who manipulate or enslave others. The one known as Yahweh felt a great responsibility to these entities. However, the Orion group had been able to impress upon the peoples the name Yahweh as the one responsible for this elitism. Yahweh was then able to take what you would call stock of its vibratory patterns and became, in effect, a more eloquently effective sound vibration complex. In this complex, the old Yahweh, now unnamed, but meaning he comes, began to send positively oriented philosophy. This was approximately in your past of 2, we correct this instrument, 3300 years. Thus, the intense portion of what has become known as Armageddon was joined. So, that's a big, pretty loaded answer from Ra about how Yahweh had genetically altered the bodies for the Martians back 75,000 years ago. And so there was a genetic memory of a specialness that existed within them. And those who were gathered near Egypt who had this genetic memory were able to start to give in to those ideas of them being an elite type of person genetically. And so Orion was able then to come in and exacerbate those thought forms. And Yahweh felt very responsible for this having happened. So Yahweh tried to intervene. However, Orion was able then to co-opt the name Yahweh as the one who created these beings and also indulged in their quote-unquote specialness, their elitism. And so this then obviously became a problem for Yahweh, and the original Yahweh changed their name and has continued to try to ameliorate the distortions created by their original genetic manipulation of humans. So interestingly, I think Ra refers to the seeds of negativity, these seeds, as always, being those of the elite, the different, those who manipulate or enslave others. So I think that's a good place where we can all look at our own thoughts and where we might indulge in thoughts of being elite, different, or desiring to manipulate or enslave others, because that's where negative polarization occurs, is within those desires and beliefs. But I also think the other interesting part about this session is, or this question is, thus the intense portion of what has become known as Armageddon was joined. So essentially, since 3,300 years ago, Orion and the Confederation have been working really hard to gain souls for their side, let's say. And, Ra does go on to talk about later about how in the astral realms in fourth density, there are entities who actually do battle, Confederation and Orion. And by doing this, they're balancing the energies on Earth so that those energies don't become manifest on Earth. Instead, they manifest within their battling. So I'm assuming that's pretty much what Ra is talking about. And as far as Armageddon, when I do a Google for the definition of Armageddon, because I think we think of Armageddon as like the end of the world, but the definition in regards to how it's referred to in the New Testament is the final battle between good and evil before the day of judgment. So I'm pretty sure that's pretty much how Ra is using that term. The last battle between good and evil before the day of judgment, because that's what we're going through. And it's the last 3,300 years of the cycle, essentially. So that's just been their ongoing purpose, the Orion and the Confederation, battling over who's going to join their side at the end of harvest. And also then Orion has the goal of enslaving those who won't be harvested as well. Whereas the Confederation just wants all beings to be free, and also then hopefully harvesting into fourth density positive The Orion group is okay with a smaller harvest if they also get to enslave a large majority of Earthlings. So, 24.7, Dawn says, "Could you create another cough for us, please?" And Ra coughs. And in 24.8, Dawn says, "Thank you. I have a question about how the Orion group got in 3,600 years ago. How did they get through the quarantine? Was that a random window effect?" I am Ra. At that time, this was not entirely so, as there was a proper calling for this information. When there is a mixed calling, the window effect is much more put into motion by the ways of the densities. The quarantine in this case was, shall we say, not patrolled so closely due to the lack of strong polarity, the windows thus needing to be very weak in order for penetration. As your harvest approaches, those forces of what you would call light work according to their call. The ones of Orion have the working only according to their call. This calling is, in actuality, not nearly as great. Thus, due to the way of empowering or squares, there is much resistance to penetration. Yet free will must be maintained, and those desiring negatively oriented information, as you would call it, must then be satisfied by those moving through by the window effect. Cough. So, back then, 3,600 years ago, these beings were feeling much more elite, very elite compared to the other beings that they came across. So they were calling for information in regards to this feeling of being elite and this desire, presumably this desire to enslave those lesser than them. So when a call for negative information is made, which, as Ross says, doesn't happen very often, and so the resistance to that call is very high, so there isn't just random opportunities for negative information to fall into our consciousness, but when specific entities or specific groups are calling for this negative information, then that information does come through the quarantine. So it wasn't precisely random, but it was a window in the quarantine that was created by a call for that information. So 24.9, Dawn says, "Then Yahweh, in an attempt to correct what he saw as what I might call a mistake, I know you don't want to call it that, started 3,300 years ago with the positive philosophy. Were both the Orion and Yahweh philosophies impressed telepathically, or were there other techniques used?" I am Ra. There were two other techniques used, one by the entity no longer called Yahweh, who still felt that if it could raise up entities which were superior to the negative forces, that these superior entities could spread the law of one. Thus this entity, Yad-He Shinvah-He, came among your people in form according to incarnate being and mated in the normal reproductive manner of your physical complexes, thus birthing a generation of much larger beings, these beings called Anak. The other method used to greater effect later in the scenario, as you would call it, was the thought form, such as we often use among your peoples, to suggest the mysterious or the sublime. You may be familiar with some of these appearances. Questioner: Could you state some of those after making the instrument cough, please? Cough. I am Ra. This is information which you may discover. However, we will briefly point the way by indicating the so-called wheel within a wheel and the cherubim with a sleepless eye. So we have Yahweh incarnating and walking among us physically again, one last time, and mating with us, and therefore creating larger body complexes that Yahweh believed would have more power in disseminating the law of one and an ability to defeat the negative forces. Obviously, this didn't work out as Yahweh had planned, but there were also thought form visions among peoples that were given. As Ra says, the so-called wheel within a wheel and the cherubim with sleepless eye. So the wheel within a wheel is a concept that's meant to invoke the complex structure of reality, all of these wheels turning and affecting each other and nested within each other. And the cherubim with a sleepless eye was the idea of the angels watching over us, essentially. That there are angels in the sky who never stop watching over us. That's why they have a sleepless eye. So these are the thought form visions that were given to us as Yahweh was trying to counter the negative effects of their previous workings. So, 2411, Don says, very good. Did the Orion group use similar methods for their impression 3,600 years ago? I am Ra. The group or empire had an emissary in your skies at that time. Questioner, can you describe that emissary? Ra says, this emissary was of your fiery nature, which was hidden by the nature of cloud in the day. This was to obliterate the questions of those seeing such a vehicle and to make it consonant with these entities' concept of what you may call the Creator. Questioner, and then how was the impression or information passed on to the entities after they saw this fiery cloud? I am Ra. By thought transfer and by the causing of fiery phenomena and other events to appear as being miraculous through the use of thought forms. So, 3,600 years ago, the Orion group had a emissary in the skies that appeared at night as a flame. And this was consonant with what those entities expected the Creator to look like. And therefore, this emissary then created phenomena that looked like miracles and also used fire to create unexplained incidences. And my guess is the biggest incidence of this would be the burning bush that Moses saw and spoke to him. And the bush spoke and the bush burned, but the bush was not consumed by flames. So it was an illusory flame that Moses saw that spoke to him. So things of this nature, and then also thought communication to plant these potential thoughts. This is how Orion did their working 3,600 years ago. So, 2414, Don asks, then were there any prophets that we have now recorded that sprung from this era or soon after it? I am Ra. Those of the empire were not successful in maintaining their presence for long after the approximate 3000 date in your history and were, perforce, left with the decision to physically leave the skies. The so-called prophets were often given mixed information, but the worst that the Orion group could do was to cause these prophets to speak of doom, as prophecy in those days was the occupation of those who love their fellow beings and wish only to be of service to them and to the Creator. So, Orion didn't really have, after 600 years or so of directly trying to influence us, their success wasn't great enough for them to remain in our skies. So they had to actually leave our planet as they were here in some physical form. And there were prophets at that time, but nobody became a prophet for profit, let's say. Like, I think today that's much more of a phenomenon where people claim to be the voice of God and are doing so because it can make them a lot of money. But back then, they were genuinely doing it as a service. So it wasn't necessarily possible to detune the instruments receiving, but the beings who were calling for information through these instruments had a mixed calling. So Orion was able to come through, but the only thing they could do was make false prophecies about terrible things that were going to happen. And then, as Ra has said before, this, of course, then removes a lot of trust from those prophets when these prophecies of doom, these catastrophes, don't happen. And as we know it from our modern day experience of this phenomena, this isn't always the case. It's not always the case. Like, a prophet doesn't lose all of their followers when they have a false prophecy. A lot of beings engage with the sunk cost fallacy of having followed this particular voice of God and aren't able to completely remove themselves from the influence of the prophet that has essentially lied to them. So, 24:15, Dawn says, after making the instrument cough, and then Ra interrupts with a cough. Dawn says, could you tell me if you're saying the Orion group was successful in polluting, shall we say, some of the positively oriented prophets with messages of doom? I am Ra. This is correct. Your next query shall be the last full query for this session. So, yes, the Orion group was successful in polluting the positively oriented prophets with messages of doom. 24.17, Dawn says, could you tell me why the Orion group had to leave after, I believe, it figures to be a 600-year period? Why they had to vacate? I am Ra. Although the impression that they had given to those who called them was that these entities were an elite group, that which you know as diaspora occurred, causing much dispersion of these peoples so that they became an humbler and more honorable breed, less bellicose, and more aware of the loving kindness of the one Creator. The creation about them tended towards being somewhat bellicose, somewhat oriented towards the enslavement of others, but they themselves, the target of the Orion group by means of their genetic superiority/weakness, became what you may call the underdogs, thereby letting the feelings of gratitude for their neighbors, their family, and their one Creator begin to heal the feelings of elitism, which led to the distortions of power over others, which had caused their own bellicosity. Any short queries may be asked now. So again, this is a very, let's say, loaded response from Ra, because, they are clearly talking about the Jewish religion, and when they refer to diaspora, that's a very important part of Jewish history, when they were forced out of their quote-unquote ancestral homeland given to them by their God because of their elite nature. And so this forced separation and splitting and sending of these peoples to further reaches made them a minority that didn't have the same kind of power that they had when they were all together. So even though society still had bellicosity, still had the concept of enslaving of others, these beings were knocked down a couple notches by being forced out of their homeland, and they had to rely on the kindness of others. And this situation then created a lot of gratitude within them. And as we know, to polarize and harvest negatively requires 95% service to self. You only have a tiny little 5% window of service to others to maintain a high level of negative polarity. So as they felt gratitude for those who were willing to help them in their lessened state, that chipped away at their negative polarity, because then they wanted to reciprocate the kind things that people had done for them, because they didn't deserve it. These people treated them kindly without any sort of expectation. So this created a reorientation of their negative thought forms. And while I do think that these sessions are talking about a specific group of people in history, I do think that in general, this has happened more than just in this one situation. It's happening now in a lot of ways, and will happen more and more through the increased climate disasters that are happening in certain areas on our Earth. Like, it already is happening, where people are being displaced. And the consequence then of being displaced creates this need for help of others. As we talked about just in a very recent session, how our bodies are designed to force us, to make us weak, so that we're forced to rely on each other. When you have a slightly negatively oriented group that are all together, working together to exploit those that they see as separate from the group, then they're helping each other in a way that makes the pack strong, right? But when you're alone out there and a stranger does something kind to help you, that's a lot of the times going to change you. It's going to soften you. And so I think that's just one of the ways Catalyst works in our logos. And I do think these opportunities, again, at this portion of our end times are happening more and more. And it's just more and more opportunities to hopefully soften and polarize towards the positive polarity. And as I was saying, even in an earlier, just recently again too, about how I think it's more likely for a negative being to move to the positive end of the spectrum than it is for a positive being to move to the negative end of the spectrum. And one of those reasons is because our logos has a bias towards kindness. And so these situations are set up to unfold in this way, to hopefully untangle the distortions that create bellicosity and a desire to enslave others and manipulate and control others. When you have nothing and somebody helps you out of the goodness of their own heart, that isn't just that physical action happening. There is magical vibrations that occur, magical healing vibrations that occur within that act of generosity. And then the automatic reciprocation is gratitude. So, essentially, the diaspora sent the followers of Yahweh to various places on earth where they weren't able to work together to maintain their power. They became more dependent on the people around them who weren't of the same genetic elitism. And then they saw that these beings didn't deserve to be looked down upon or treated poorly because of their supposed difference in genetic manifestations. So, wrapping it up a little bit, we've got a few more here. Dawn says in 24:18, "There's one thing that's been bothering me a little bit, which I was just reading about." And Ra interrupts here with a cough, remembering that they needed to cough between each session. But here Ra interrupts, and then Dawn continues and says, "It's not too important, but I would really be interested to know if Dwight Eisenhower met with either the Confederation or the Orion group during the 1950s or that time. I am Ra. The one of which you speak met with thought forms which are indistinguishable from third density. This was a test. We, the Confederation, wished to see what would occur if this extremely positively oriented and simple congenial person with no significant distortions towards power happened across peaceful information and the possibilities which might append therefrom. We discovered that this entity did not feel that those under his care could deal with the concepts of other beings and other philosophies. Thus, an agreement reached then allowed him to go his way, ourselves to do likewise, and a very quiet campaign, as we have heard you call it, be continued alerting your peoples to our presence gradually. Events have overtaken this plan." Cough. Is there any short query before we close? So, the raw material is the only reason that this Dwight Eisenhower situation is even on my radar. And reading this session before I recorded, the book 5 information has like specific stuff from Jim, where Jim talks about how it was February 1954 that this event happened. So I did a little Googling, and apparently on February 20th, 1954, Dwight Eisenhower disappeared for an evening. And a lot of rumors circulated, obviously, and the alien rumor was one of those rumors. That he had died was another rumor. And what the White House ultimately said was that he had a chipped tooth that required emergency dental surgery. And that's why he was MIA for several hours on this evening. But apparently the alien rumor is true. However, it's hard to say how much Dwight realized they were aliens. They said that they were thought forms which are indistinguishable from third density. So they came appearing as humans to talk to him. And one of the reports that I read specifically did say that the aliens offered to come and help us if we were willing to dismantle all of our nuclear weapons. And based on the context here of what Ross says, that seems like maybe that's possibly true. Like that's maybe what happened. But Dwight Eisenhower was able to make this decision for all of us and say, no, my people aren't ready. And the Confederation allowed that decision to stand. And even if it's hard to say, though, if they would have followed through, because Rod does say it was a test. It was just a test to see what this person would say. They evaluated him as an extremely positively oriented and simple, congenial person with no significant distortions towards power. But he was very invested in the status quo, which he thought served us. He thought served our reality, was the status quo. So, it's hard to look objectively at all of the things that any president of the United States has done and call them an extremely positively oriented person, because we have a legacy of so many horrible things as a nation, and Dwight Eisenhower's presidency wasn't bereft of these terrible things, of these military actions and these kinds of things. So this is, again, another example of an extremely positively oriented being who still had a lot of third density distortions. But apparently the Confederation did meet with Dwight Eisenhower, and Dwight Eisenhower said, nah, we don't want any aliens to come and meddle with us anymore. We aren't ready for that. And they didn't push. They just accepted it and continued to work behind the scenes. So, 2420, Dawn asks, the only other question that went with that is, was there a crashed spaceship, and are there small bodies now stored in our military installations? I am Ra. We do not wish to infringe upon your future. Gave we you this information, we might be giving you more than you could appropriately deal with in the space-time nexus of your present, somewhat muddled configuration of military and intelligence thought. Therefore, we shall withhold this information. So, this is obviously talking about Roswell. I find Ra's response here very interesting. I'm pretty sure they're saying you in the singular to Dawn, because just a few sessions before this, they were talking about military and intelligence and UFOs, and Dawn wasn't able to really integrate that. It was really disturbing to Dawn to hear the things that Ra had to say in this regard. So I feel like it's possible that the whole Roswell incident was a type of psyop. And I don't know. I am biased towards believing that so many UFO events were just labeled as so by our government to hide what they are doing. That's just my personal belief in how so many things have unfolded, and that's based a lot on what Ra says, but just reading this question and answer as deeply and critically as I can, I wonder if that is what Ra is saying, is that this has more to do with military and intelligence than it has to do with actual extraterrestrial beings. But maybe I'm missing evidence that exists otherwise. Again, just my own personal opinion on that one. So, 2421, Dawn says, okay, sorry to bother you with these types of questions. And then Ra interrupts with another cough. And Dawn continues and says, but they were just bothering me. We will continue in our next session with the Law of One, and keep that uppermost in the scope of the book, and try to get more deeply into the philosophy as we build a framework for reference to the philosophy. Thank you very much. And Ra begins to speak, but then Dawn interrupts one more time and says, oh, please, I'm almost ready. Is there anything that we can do to make the instrument more comfortable? I am Ra. You are conscientious. Be careful only to adjust this instrument's upper appendages if its upper body is elevated. I am Ra. All is well. It is our joy to speak with you. We leave you in the love and the light of the one infinite Creator. Go forth, therefore, rejoicing in the power and the peace of the one Creator. Adonai. So, I find it interesting that once in a while, Ra will be like, are there any other final questions that you may have for us? And they know that it's like just a kind of frivolous question that's on Dawn's mind, but they can see it, right? They can see what's going on in Dawn's mind. So they say, hey, did you have something else you wanted to ask? And then Dawn dumps like frivolous questions at the end. Last session was about the movie Battle Beyond the Stars, and here it's about Roswell. But Ra does seem to kind of open the door to allow Dawn to ask those questions. And then they're trying to leave, but Dawn really needed to ask about Carla again. And they say, it's fine, she's fine, just adjust her upper appendages if her upper body is elevated. So again, give her a massage if she's feeling stiff when sitting up. But that's session 24. And again, that was a pretty abbreviated session. It has 23 responses, but many of the so-called questions and answers are labeled independently, even though it's just raw coughing. So we really only have more like 15, 16 maybe in this one. So Carla is sick now. She will continue to be sick for 3 months, Ross says, at least, going forward. So they will be a little shorter now, some of them. And I think once her and Jim when she gets well and her and Jim dial in the sexual energy transfers, there are some much longer ones in the future too. They aren't all just short going forward, obviously. But that was session 24. And some really interesting information in there, as we usually do. I think I say that probably every time, because what else is there to say? There's always so much in each session. And I hope I talked about everything that you were interested in hearing about in regards to this session. If I didn't, and you have any questions, feel free to pop them off at me wherever you would like to, in the comments on the YouTube video. You can send me a message on Substack. I don't really have my email or anything anywhere, but my general working email, if you ever did want to send me an email, it's just jade.norby@gmail.com. That's where you can reach me. That's not my primary email. That's my secondary email. So I might not be on top of responding in there, but I do check it. And if you do send me a message there, I will get it. So yeah, feel free to reach out there about anything if you want. Thank you to everyone who has reached out, whether it's with gratitude or financial support. Thank you so much. Or if it's even just energetic support, just thoughts of gratitude that you haven't specifically articulated to me. I still feel it. And I'm super grateful that we get to do this project together. Again, it wouldn't be what it is without the support of everyone else creating a calling for this information through me. So I'm just really grateful that I get to do that. And I'm grateful that there are beings who put that energy into this pathway as well. I couldn't do it without you. So I hope everyone has a wonderful time. Thank you all. I love you all. I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to the Creator. I love our Creator. I love our creation. And I will see you all in session 25.